It is my great privilege to welcome this evening the member of the Universal House of Justice to share his reflections on the 5-year plan, our brother, Mr. Paul Lample.
Thank you very much, friends, for that warm welcome. I didn't know Mrs. Kadem was going to be here tonight. I was her assistant, so I hope I give a good talk, and she appreciate it. It's really a joy for me to be able to come back to this place where many years ago I became a Baha'i. In these circumstances, it gives me a chance really to reflect about the time I became a Baha'i and the sentiments and the feelings. And I think that it's a good thing that we should all do that from time to time. Because what happens is we get caught up in the various activities that we're engaged in as Baha'is, the different meetings, the different efforts for organization, the various activities. And sometimes we can disassociate ourselves, even though we're praying, even though we're reading the writings regularly, even though we're making efforts to teach and so on. But all of that activity can somehow take us to some degree apart from those profound feelings and emotions that we had when we became a Baha'i. To recall the sense of the discovery for the first time, understanding who Baha'u'llah really is. To recall the sense of the possibility, what the world could be like if Baha'u'llah's teachings were put into effect and transform it. To make a world like he described, one free of prejudice, free of extremes of wealth and poverty, where justice prevailed, where people were unified, where the oneness of humanity was reflected in the individual and collective life of humanity. The sense of humility and love and profound gratitude that one has to Baha'u'llah for, in a sense, awakening the soul, quickening the soul, and awakening the soul, your own soul, to that new reality. I also remember the sense of the possibilities for service. Even before I was a Baha'i, I went to Green Lake, and Hand of the Cause of God, William Sears, was one of the speakers there. And he was talking about teaching the faith. It was near the end of the first 5-year plan. And he was talking about teaching the faith. And I had the feeling that, yes, I can teach this religion. And then I had to realize, oh, but wait a minute, I'm an atheist. What am I talking about? Now, he was a good speaker. There's also the sense of commitment you have. You see these great, wonderful teachings of Baha'u'llah, and you say, yes, I'm going to put them into effect in my life. I remember early on when I was a Baha'i, I decided Baha'u'llah said that we should obey the law of the land. So I decided I shouldn't speed. So I wouldn't speed. I wouldn't go 1 mile an hour over the speed limit, much to the dissatisfaction of some of the Baha'is who were on traveling teaching trips with me. Also, I must confess, and May will testify, that I've done a little backsliding in that area over the years. But this chance to reconnect, to see the world again as we did when we first became Baha'is, and just feel that spirit and see that possibility and recognize that what Baha'u'llah has come to create in our hearts to inspire us to create in the world is really something worthwhile, something worth any sacrifice, something worth any effort that we can make, even to contribute to that process even a little bit. When we're caught up in this process of assembly meetings and committees and various activities and so on, we can forget the fact that the purpose of the faith is not to have more meetings or to have more committees or to form various administrative bodies. As important as those things are, I know many of you are out there working in these areas, sacrificing, making efforts, and it's important. But what's important to realize is that those things are not the end. Baha'u'llah didn't come to create those things per se. Those things are a means to an end. And Shoghi Effendi warned us very early on that when we're talking about the concept of Baha'i administration, we have to make sure that this means doesn't become an end in itself. The purpose is the transformation of our own lives, of the lives of our family, of the lives of our community, of the whole society, by translating what Baha'u'llah has taught us into reality and into action. And it's kind of like the idea of inverting a pyramid. Instead of thinking of the mass of believers and then raising up this administrative hierarchy that kind of climbs higher and higher levels like a pyramid, actually the process is completely inverted. That the institutions are the servants of the people. The goal is not to create institutions per se. Institutions are created to help raise up people, to cultivate individuals who manifest certain characteristics and who work in a constructive way to transform the world around them. So what we want is a mass of people who in their daily efforts and their daily lives try to be like Abdu'l Baha, to live the Baha'i life, and in so doing, interact with the countless other human beings on the planet, give them a measure of this divine revelation, lift up their hearts, change the world, make it a different place, take what's written and translate it into reality, and gradually unwind this old world order that exists and that has so many problems and faults and conditions of human suffering, and try to create a different kind of a world. That's what it means to be a Baha'i. That's what we felt when we first became Baha'is, and we have to continue to revisit that and keep that vision before us, so that when we engage in all of these other essential activities, we never lose track. We never lose our connection with Baha'u'llah. We never lose track of what is the purpose of why we're doing all of these things, which is to transform the world. Now, if we were to take ourselves into account this some 160 some years after the faith began, we'd have to see that, all right, to some extent we have been able to translate these teachings into action in our personal lives to some degree. In our professional lives, we have some outstanding Baha'is in different fields, artists, scholars, people in the business field, in law, in social and economic development, and they've made an impact in their professions, and they have conveyed concepts from the Baha'i writings into the broader society and helped to contribute in that way to making the world a better place. We have some collective enterprises, some of our own development organizations, schools, some universities, various agencies in the United States and in all parts of the world that are contributing in some way to this transformation of the social reality to bring it more in line with Baha'u'llah's teachings. But we should also recognize that, in a sense, we're still too small. There are not enough Baha'is, not enough individuals who recognize Baha'u'llah and are striving to put his teachings into practice to really make a significant kind of impact in the world, to bring it in a very dramatic way much closer to Baha'u'llah's aims and aspirations for the human race. So we have to get bigger. This is a theme that the House of Justice has talked to us over and over again in the years past. We have to get bigger. But it's not for the sake of just increasing our membership, just so there are more Baha'is around us, but it's for this greater purpose. It's for this transforming process in individual and collective lives and in the transformation of society. The only way to understand this, the challenges that face us, is in the form of this embryonic process, like the baby in the womb, goes through certain stages. And at each stage in its development, there's certain things that need to be done. At the beginning, cells need to divide. There's no sense talking about specializing and having a brain until cells divide. There's a period of time when the human body, when the embryo is developing the brain, and the mother needs protein. And if the mother isn't getting that, then it doesn't matter how intelligent the embryo is supposed to be according to the genetic code, if the building blocks of the proteins are not there, that potentiality won't be realized. So the faith goes through stages. It goes through this same organic developmental process. And the tablets of the divine plan, the various stages of the plan, demarcate for us what we're supposed to do at any particular stage in our development. So when we start to think about this concept of the 5-year plan and what we're being asked to do, we can't see it merely in terms of the specific elements and specific pieces. Oh, that we're supposed to have a core activity, a devotional meeting or a study circle or a children's class, or that we're supposed to have a study circle and study an institute course. Yes, all of those are elements of the process, but unless we see it in the broader context and really in terms of this organic historical process, then we can't really appreciate what we're being asked to do. Instead, we get caught up in the petty details of it. Should we study this book or should we study that book? And when you have a devotional meeting, do we all have to come to it, or can some people have it here or some people have it here? Or what is the job of the local assembly, and how come the area teaching committee is taking over our job, and should they be doing that? All of those are important questions. All have to be sorted out, but you lose the context of the overall enterprise, and suddenly these elements that need to be worked out, mistakes will be made, we gradually have to solve them, become big, become our whole reality. And again, we're out of touch with the needs of the hour, with the demands of this particular stage in our development. So the House of Justice in each plan defines and frames the mission, the lines of action that we need to follow during that time. And then that contributes to the organic development of the faith that will continue to unfold over 1,000 years. And gradually we will see those individuals, those families, those communities, that society change and transform as the faith grows and can start to manifest all of these latent potentialities that Baha'u'llah put within it. So the House of Justice has framed the challenge of the time as advancing the process of entry by troops. It really set this a quarter century from 1996 to the year 2021 to focus on this single aim. All the plans focus on this, entry by troops. A stage that Shoghi Effendi talked about was one of a series of stages for the growth of the faith. First, a steady flow of fresh recruits, followed by the entry by troops of peoples and nations into the faith. People becoming Baha'is not just one by one, but by tens, by hundreds, by thousands. And then later, some period in the future, after some series of events, a mass conversion of peoples and nations to the faith. But our job is to figure out this piece, entry by troops. Entry by troops began even during the lifetime of Shoghi Effendi. In Uganda, in some other countries, in Africa, in Indonesia, suddenly the faith would grow, hundreds of people, tens of thousands of people, but we didn't know what to do with so many people. Some countries would grow from 500 to 50,000 or 100,000 believers, but we didn't know how to deepen so many, how to organize community, how to educate all of their children. And the issue stood for almost 4 decades until 1996, when the House of Justice started to organize and focus our efforts to become more systematic in learning how to solve this problem of growth. Our problem of growth has never been whether people want to become Baha'is or not. They definitely want to become Baha'is. Maybe not all of the 6 billion people on earth, maybe not all 6 billion. Plenty of people are happy with what they have. But out of that 6 billion, many, many millions, maybe hundreds of millions, maybe even 1 or 2 of those billion would be ready to embrace the faith if they even heard about it, if we could present it to them, if we could, once they embrace it, create the pattern of life that would sustain them and nurture them. So this has been the challenge that we've been facing and struggling to learn about over this past 9 years, since 1996, what we'll continue to be learning about for the next 16 years, and why it's so critical to focus and finally learn it. Because after all, it took 40 years to get us to this point where we could learn to be more systematic. Now it took us another 9 years where for the first time we're starting to see in the world clusters that are able to actually pull this process off. They're able to bring in 100, 500, 1,000 new Baha'is in a year, but this time not just enroll them, but also educate them, train them, help them to stand up and take responsibility for the work of the faith, to teach their children, to teach their neighbors and their family, to organize their own study circles, and so on. So for the first time in now half a century, we see the fruits of this process of entry by troops. We know how it works. We can understand how to sustain it. How much more important it becomes then to focus in the time that the House of Justice has given us to get this work done. Otherwise, what happens? Things dwindle on, we don't do the work, people would like to hear but find no way of hearing about it. Or they come in again and find no pattern that can sustain them. Now, I want to share some experiences of what lies at the heart of this process. Because what we're seeing in the world, as the Baha'is have made these first efforts over the past couple of years to put all of these elements together, the training process that the House of Justice talked about in the Institute, the community building element that lies in the various core activities. Because if you think about these core activities that the House of Justice described, on the one hand, again, we could think in terms of more meetings to go to. All right, so here's my busy schedule, now I have more meetings to go to. But if we look closer, what we see is that this study circle, this devotional meeting, this children's class are all the beginnings, the embryonic point where community building begins to grow, because they're all centered around the Word of God. They're all centered around a group of people coming together either to study the Word, to recite the Word in prayer, to educate their children according to the Word. This is religious community. This is something that's meaningful for us as believers. It's not just more meetings to go to, it's the heart of our spiritual life. And then community building processes begin there. And then when we open up that pattern of community to anybody who wants to experience, not just for Baha'is alone, because Baha'u'llah's revelation is not just for the Baha'is. These teachings are for everybody, anybody who wants them. And so now we have a vehicle, we have an environment where people can come and draw out of the Baha'i experience whatever they want. If they want to come worship with us, come worship. And if you want to study these writings, study. And if you want your children educated according to these principles and concepts, come bring them. And if that's all you want, that's fine. But if you want to learn more, that's fine also. And then teaching increases as people struggle. They want to learn more, they have questions, and we figure out how to teach them. So in this process that's unfolding around the world, we have a kind of an integration, a marriage between training, between community life, between teaching the faith, that comes together and creates quite a powerful pattern. Think about, for example, the concept of the tutor, this person who has completed this first sequence of courses of the Institute and becomes capable of helping to guide others on a path of service. That's what the 7th book in the Institute sequence is called, Walking Together on a Path of Service. Now here's this individual walking their own path of service, trying to teach, doing home visits to visit Baha'is, having their own children's class, now participating in teaching activities, personal and collective. Now they reach the point where, all right, I'm learning how to help other people walk this path of service. I've walked it, I've experienced it, I've made mistakes, I've learned a little bit along the way. Now I want to help other people walk the same path. This becomes quite a powerful thing. In the past, we were able to light the spark of faith in people's hearts At one point, the faith during the 6-year plan before the Holy Year, in a 2-year period, the faith grew by 1 million new Baha'is in a 2-year period. We went from 4 million to 5 million. But we didn't know what to do with them. Now, you know what to do with them. Help them walk a path of service. Instead of just lighting the spark of faith, Shoghi Effendi said, teaching doesn't end until the person can stand on their own and serve the faith. Now we have a vehicle for doing that. So imagine this tutor then, one person walking a path of service. Goes out, starts a study circle. Let's say it gets 6 people to join. All right? Now it's 7 people walking a path of service. Not just the one person serving. You see, think of our communities not so long ago. A community of 20 people or 30 people. All right? Maybe the chairman, the secretary, the individual who comes and gives the deepening. 3, 4, 5 people take care of the 30 people. What do the 30 people do? They come to the meetings. And if you're an active Baha'i, you come to the meeting. And if you're an inactive Baha'i, you don't come to the meeting. But you don't need many people to take care of 30. As soon as you stop looking at just the 30 and you look out and you see all the people of the city and all the people of the county, suddenly that's a lot of people. That's hundreds of thousands of children, potentially. Maybe 1 million people or more, potentially. Some of those people want some aspect of Baha'u'llah's revelation. Now, all of those 30 people better be active workers. And even 30 is not enough. We need more if we're going to serve that sizable population. So the tutor becomes the agent for raising up more of these capable workers. One person leads 6, 7 people walk a path of service. Let's say now they study this first book of the Institute that talks about prayer and reading the writings and life after death. Now 2 of these people get excited about it. They say, all right, well, we're going to start a devotional meeting. So 2 out of the 6 start a devotional meeting. They each get 5 people, their friends, their family, their neighbors, to come to these devotional meetings and be touched by the spirit of Baha'u'llah's revelation. Now what? All right? 1, 6, 10 more. All right? 17 people now suddenly being touched by the spirit of the faith, being moved. Maybe not all the way, but to some degree. You continue to train. 2 other people, you complete book 2. Now out of the 6, 2 people decide, all right, well, we'll do home visits. We're going to go visit some of the Baha'is that we don't see around. We're going to talk with them. We're going to encourage them. We're going to share aspects of the writing. We're going to learn from them. We're going to share some of the things we know. Maybe they have family. We'll teach them, or neighbors, and we'll teach them as we go. So let's say, imagine again, each of these 2 people go out and make 5 more contacts. People that they're encouraging, people that they're moving. Suddenly, now it's 27 people moving on this path. And you complete the 3rd book, and the last 2 people decide they're going to start children's classes. So they go out and they each get 5 children in their class. But each of those children has 2 parents, you see? So there's another 30 people in the process. So suddenly, it's like an organic process emerging. One trunk of a tree, one tutor, puts out 6 branches for the study circle, who then have their own branches, people that they're reaching out, souls that they're touching, exposing to Baha'u'llah's revelation. And those branches have branches. So this thing starts to grow. This power of the tutor, suddenly around that tutor, 10, 20, 30 people, 50 people are being moved or being touched or somehow being drawn into the process. Some move further, some don't move so far. Again, it's up to every individual to decide and respond how they wish to Baha'u'llah's revelation. So it's a disinterested process. The Baha'i doesn't have a vested interest in converting you. It's up to you. It's between you and God. If somebody doesn't want to hear about Baha'u'llah's teachings, Baha'u'llah will not let you teach them. So this process of teaching is one of opening up and offering and seeing how people accept. And if they have questions and would like to know more, then the teacher helps them. Now, in this movement that we're seeing worldwide, in neighborhoods all over the world, this process is growing. In one cluster in India, there was a family that moved in, and they had a tutor in the family. They just started this process. One cluster where there were no Baha'is, a D cluster, no Baha'is in the cluster. In January 2003, they started this process there. They tried to invite the adults. They weren't interested. They started a children's class. The children came. When the parents saw the change in their children, well, then they were interested. Then they came as well. In a 2-year period, they went from no Baha'is to something like 250 Baha'is in that cluster, in 9 different villages, with 60 people in the institute process in a 2-year period, 10 who had completed the entire sequence. Of course, that's India, so anything can happen in India, right? But in a cluster in Taiwan, individuals did the same thing. Taiwan is much like teaching the faith here. It's not so easy. The communities are fairly small. The people struggle. There was one counselor who visited one community where they saw this same process at work. It was a Baha'i community of 9 people. One of the people became a tutor and started this process. And when the counselor came and started talking to the members of the community, and particularly to this tutor, it came out that, well, this tutor had started the study circle, invited people. And they could almost draw this little tree and all the branches and all the people who were coming to think. Some who had become Baha'is, some who were not Baha'is, but were coming because they got something out of the process. And soon they saw it was like about 40 people in this little network that had grown. Well, now look at this experience. 40 people in this network, only 9 in this Baha'i community. So the counselor started talking, now how is this going to happen? Are these 40 going to come into these 9? Or do these 9 join this 40? Or do these 9 duplicate the experience of this one tutor? So that suddenly there's 9 networks of 20, 30, 40 people. And the friend said, well, you know, we'll lose our intimacy if we don't all come together every time for a meeting. What intimacy is lost? They asked this person. With these 40 people you interact with, do you have intimacy? Yes. We love one another. We're always with one another. We care about our children. We're visiting our homes. More intimacy than ever. Sometimes we put in place certain patterns, certain habits of action that effectively keep us small. So we have one devotional meeting where everybody across the town comes to the one devotional meeting, even though it takes an hour maybe to get through all the traffic and so on. Finally, some people decide not to come. But will I be able to bring my friend, my neighbor? No. So we stay at 9. If we branch out this way, 9 times 4, we have 360. So all over the world, we're starting to see this as the result of the Institute process. This marriage between the Institute, between community building, between teaching. These little trees growing all over. And what happens then when these people who are the first branches complete the whole sequence, they become tutors themselves. It's like the fruit ripening on the tree, falling off and grows another tree. So soon the tree is surrounded. Soon the tree becomes a forest. Now, if we look at that on a global scale, you saw the Rizvan message, the statistics the House of Justice gave. We have about 20,000 people who have completed Book 7, who have reached this point of becoming this tutor, capable of walking this path of service and guiding other people on the path of service. Now, there are 200,000 people who have completed at least the first book. There are 100,000 children and junior youth in more than 10,000 children's classes. There are more than 100,000 people coming to 15,000 devotional meetings worldwide. So just like we saw, one person moves maybe 20, 30 people along this path, 20,000 people move something like 300,000 or 400,000 people along this path. And out of those, something like 100,000 are not yet Baha'is. What if the number becomes 40,000 tutors? What if it becomes 80,000 tutors? Now you're talking about moving 1 million people along this path. And this is the inevitable fruit of this process. It's what's possible for every Baha'i in whatever cluster they live in. Even if you have no other Baha'is in your cluster, even though people are not as receptive as they are in India, you can start to grow this network. So your cluster grows stronger. You have more contacts. You're able to multiply your activities. You're able to train more people. And then you reach this critical mass of capacity where you're able to establish these intensive programs of growth. So what is an individual process grows to a kind of a critical mass and then becomes something much more profound in an intensive program of growth. Now, I know you've looked at the things from the Teaching Center, the guidance from the National Assembly and the Teaching Committee. Already in the United States, you have 28 clusters, most of whom who have established their intensive program of growth and initiated the process. The aim is to have maybe as many as 60 as a result of the last Pensacola meeting, maybe as many as 60 of these clusters reach this level just by the end of the plan. So the process is well underway here, but we don't all understand it. We're not all in one of these 20 clusters. There are 1,000 clusters in the United States, so most likely you're not in one of these advanced clusters. You're not in the 2%, you're in the 98%. But even in this area, you have one of these clusters. And yes, you see mistakes are made, there are problems, there are struggles, but that's an inevitable part of the process. There's no way to avoid it. But what begins is a focused period of activity, a cycle lasting 3, 4, 6 months that has a number of distinct phases in it. There's a planning phase where the institutions consult, where they look at the human resources that they have, where they decide what kind of activities they can multiply, how they can reach out most effectively to people. In this context, we have two experiences in the Baha'i world. The places where it's very easy to teach, and the places where it's a little bit more challenging to teach. In the places where it's easy to teach, people are literally lined up to become Baha'is. There's not enough teachers. There's not enough tutors. There's not enough children's class teachers. So the challenge in those clusters is to develop more human resources. And they can literally calculate at the beginning of one of these cycles, how many workers do we have? And how many places can we make for the people who want to join us to join us? So in one cluster in Kenya, they calculated that they could have 100 new people in their various activities. So they organized a 2-week teaching campaign. After their planning phase, they launched the second phase of teaching. After the first week, more than 100 people became Baha'is. So they stopped the teaching. No sense bringing more people that you couldn't follow up with. And they moved to the third phase, which was the consolidation phase, where all of these contacts, all of these seekers are moved into core activities, firesides, other activities, so that expansion and consolidation can then go hand in hand in a seamless way. What we're seeing then in these intensive programs of growth is rather than a gradualist process of teaching and growth, one by one by one, suddenly, because you're focusing the energies of a critical mass of people, maybe 50, in some of these clusters, more than 100 people are engaged in teaching teams and home visit teams. Thank you. So in these places, what you're seeing is a focus of all of these individual powers by the institutions. So it's like light being focused to become a laser beam. It becomes much more powerful. So the gradualist process of growth is suddenly jumping to another level. In one cluster, we have one cluster in the world, the Maroon cluster in Mongolia, that has completed now 4 cycles, or it's about to complete its 4th cycle. Means every 3 months for the past year, they've organized this pattern of activity. Planning, a teaching phase, followed by a consolidation phase. What's been the result? In that cluster, again, admittedly, a place where it's easy to teach, they started the 5-year plan with 20 Baha'is. 20 Baha'is at the start of the plan. Through this steady process of training and multiplying core activities that I just described to you, a tutor helping people walk a path, they were able to grow at a fairly steady rate of about 20 Baha'is a month over the first couple years of the plan. So after the third year of the plan, they had about 400 to 500 Baha'is in the cluster. Then they moved into this stage of intensive growth. Now they had trained enough people through the Institute, they could organize them in systematic ways. And what was happening? In the first 2-week teaching phase, they had 200 new Baha'is. But instead of just enrolling them, they were able to integrate them into their pattern of action. Train more people, multiply more activities. By the second cycle, again, the same pattern, and more than 100 people became Baha'is. By this third cycle, they repeated the pattern, learned to improve on what they were doing, corrected their mistakes, another 200 people. So in about 9 months, they were able to do what they had achieved in the first 3 years of the plan in just 9 months' time. Now they have more than 100 people who have completed the entire sequence of courses. So more than 100 people who are active tutors, 500 people who are in the Institute process in this cluster. There's only 30,000 people in the cluster, and the Baha'i population has now passed more than 1,000. So more than 3% of that cluster is now Baha'i. And people are ready to become Baha'is. They're waiting. In one cluster in Ethiopia, they calculate that for every person that they can actually bring in this process, there are 2 or 3 more who are thinking of themselves as Baha'is that they just can't get to. So they look at what the Baha'is are doing and they organize their own devotional meeting. They're just imitating because there's no Baha'i who can come around and train them. So the people of the world are ready. Now it's we who are finally becoming ready for them. Now again, that's India, that's Mongolia. But what about where I live? Back when the 4-year plan began, the House of Justice wrote messages to different parts of the world. If you remember, there were 11 different messages launched the plan, 8 different messages were sent to different regions of the world. One of those regions was Europe. And the House of Justice said that they wrote to the Baha'is in Europe, the central aim of the 4-year plan, a significant advance in the process of entry by troops, is of a special significance for Europe. You should have no misgivings. It is a process that can advance in all parts of Europe, in the West as well as in the East. So even in Western Europe, the House of Justice said, this process could advance. Well, a few months ago, in Manchester and in London, in the UK, the first 2 intensive programs of growth were launched in Western Europe, surpassing even Eastern Europe. They launched before clusters in Eastern Europe launched. Now, friends, if they can do it in Western Europe, then nobody else has an excuse anymore. And what they're finding, again, that this process, it doesn't work the same everywhere. It's not a recipe. We're not talking about a cookbook, like you put in eggs, flour, and out comes a cake. These concepts of core activities, institute process, teaching the faith are different in different clusters because people are different. The Baha'is are different. The nature of the population that you're trying to reach is different. So what it takes is a lot of thought and effort to learn how to make this apply where I live. It can't be the same as it is in Mongolia or even in London. It has to be what's right for here on the North Shore in Illinois. And I have to see what people are receptive to. What's a devotional meeting? It means one thing to a population in London. It means something else to a population in a village in Africa. In one place, the Baha'is I can't remember which country it was. I think, again, it might have been Kenya. But here, or no, it was the Democratic Republic of Congo. Here, the Baha'is couldn't organize a devotional meeting and get anybody to come to it. people went to their own church. They weren't interested in coming to the Baha'i devotional meeting. So when one counselor was traveling through, they asked, well, when do people pray? They pray when a baby's born. They pray when somebody gets married. They pray when somebody dies. Okay, go to the people when these things happen and pray with them. So they went to a funeral and they said prayers. And of course, the Baha'i writings are filled with these wonderful prayers and writing about the soul and about life after death. So they went and they shared those prayers. And the people were so touched and impressed. And as is traditional there, they brought those who came to pray aside to give them gifts and special food. And the Baha'i said, no, thank you. We came because a relative of a Baha'i passed away. We came in a spirit of solidarity and love to share our teachings, to pray for them, to help their soul advance in the next world. You should give these gifts to other people, to the others. We don't want to take them. So at the next funeral that happened, guess who were the first people invited to come and say prayers at the gathering? So the Baha'is had found a culturally appropriate way to provide this experience to the people. And everybody has to do the same thing. So in London, it's different than it is in other places. Here, it'll be different. But in each place, what we're seeing is this process underway in London, in a place where people have struggled with growth, struggled to get anybody to even come to anything. They worked, they established the institute process, they slowly grew some of these trees of tutors, learning how to visit people, how to go. At one point, just the experience of Baha'i going to visit a Baha'i in their home and sharing some of the teachings was a challenge for people. People who had been Baha'is for decades. But they didn't know how to do it. Why? Because they were used to going to the meeting where somebody else would come and talk. Now I have to go talk, and I don't know how. And I'm afraid, and I'm nervous. So I get up my courage, I go, I read from my script. I'm afraid I'm making a mistake, But then I do it again, and I do it again, and gradually I become comfortable. People surprise themselves. They became skilled. Now they could learn how to invite people. They didn't know how to invite people before. And story after story has come from this London cluster demonstrating this process of transformation. In their first cycle of growth, they were able to organize 37 teaching teams, where 155 Baha'is participated in the teaching work. They made contacts with more than 500 people. 130 of those people became people who were interested, willing to come, and who came to Baha'i activities. They had immediately in their 2-week teaching phase 5 enrollments. And over the first cycle, the first 3-month cycle, 20 people became Baha'is. This is where they might not have experienced 20 people in a year. So the process is transforming even Western Europe. Let me share just briefly a couple of these stories so that you can see the process that is at work in the hearts of the Baha'is, in the transforming process of these Baha'is. One woman reported her experience. One team member met a friend of a friend who showed a great positive interest in the faith. She wanted to invite her to a talk, but was hesitant, wondering if she knew her well enough to invite her for the holy day and also to talk about the faith over coffee. So she prayed about it and then decided it was the right thing to do. And she did invite the lady by email. As soon as she sent off that email, she felt scared. Uh-oh, am I pressuring her? But then off came a letter, a lovely reply thanking her for a warm invitation. Another woman who participated in one of the intensive programs in the second week. She was busy the first week. She couldn't participate. So she participated in the second week. She made 3 home visits. One to a yoga teacher who had brought 8 people to her devotional meeting before. Another to a Sri Lankan family who had Baha'i relatives back in Sri Lanka but were there in London. She shared prayers with them, with other mothers, and invited them to a devotional meeting. And she commented that she was learning so much. She said, "It has been just fantastic. I'm bowled over with it." She made flyers to explain what Book 1 was. She then distributed those to the mothers. She said this really took courage. She was so anxious that she didn't sleep the whole night because she was afraid that somehow she would be offending people or she didn't know how to do it. But she did it, and the response was warm. People wanted it. They loved it, and they wanted to come. Another woman, her husband had just become a Baha'i 1 month earlier. Now she, her husband, and a youth were doing a home visit to the youth's home and sharing some of the aspects of the faith. My husband and one of the youth in this family did their practical part of Book 2 to share some of the teachings with the parents. And when they finished, in a very cool manner, the youth said, "And now I want to become a Baha'i." And the woman said, "Are you sure?" Later, her tutor told her, "Never ask that question again." He confirmed his reply. He wants to join the community, so they held a big welcoming party for him. Finally, there's one story. A woman met with a friend of hers. My friend and I got together after the first session of Book 1 study circle. She had some questions and we consulted about them. She seemed to be trying to articulate a question. I tried to help her share it. She said, "What makes us different? How is it that you are a Baha'i and I'm not a Baha'i? What is the difference between you and me?" I said, "I understood that a Baha'i is someone who accepts that Baha'u'llah has God's message for today, and that being a Baha'i is a realization that comes to our heart. At some point, we realize that we believe." She said, "But I do believe that. I realized it almost the first time we spoke of it together." So these stories are showing us Baha'is learning to overcome their fears, to put this into action, to seeing that after all, people do want it, and to create the opportunities to share it with those who are receptive, with those who want it. And oftentimes those people spontaneously embrace the faith because they're doing the things Baha'is do, and they're touched by the Word of God. And it's mostly us that have to make a place to allow them to become Baha'is, to recognize that they want to become agents in this process of moving people along this spiritual path. These are some of the quick comments of people. I really feel it will be easy to maintain a higher level of teaching after this 2 weeks. I learned that when I invite people and they don't accept, the world is not ended, and they're still my friends. I spoke to a girl at college about the faith. She said, "Stop. My friend needs to hear this too," and she ran and got her friend. Another person said, "It proves that when you act, you really get results. It feels so organic. It's become so normal to share prayers with friends. It's very powerful and uplifting, and I no longer feel self-conscious or apologetic about offering to share a prayer. We had dinner with a university friend and shared a prayer. It affected him deeply. Now he's attending our regular devotional meeting. The barriers were all within us. All we had to do was overcome our fear. I can see the long-term effect. Teaching is going to become the dominating passion of our lives." These are the testimony, not of the Baha'is of India or the Baha'is of Mongolia, the Baha'is of Western Europe. They're finding that they can do it, and that they can make the effort, and they can overcome these internal obstacles, and that when they do, the people of the world are receptive. And again, there are plenty who aren't. And out of the 6 billion people, maybe 5 billion are not wanting to come to these activities. But we have to not focus on the 5 billion who don't want to come and focus on the 1 billion who maybe do want to come. In the United States, 300 million people. What percentage are willing to come? Those are the ones that we're looking for. Now, you've already seen this process. I mentioned to you, you have Austin, you have Broward, you have many. I didn't want to tell you your own stories. You know them. You're hearing them from the National Assembly, reading them in the American Baha'i. In your own clusters, just in this past year, you have, again, 20 A clusters, 20 out of 1,000 clusters. About 2% of the clusters last year had roughly 20% of the enrollments in the country. So what's the question about growth? We need more clusters like that. And at this point, they're not very sophisticated. Maybe they have 3 new Baha'is. Maybe they have 10 new Baha'is. Last year, the one with the highest number of enrollments, I think, was Austin with 40-some of all ages. So it's not a lot. It doesn't mean that they've advanced very far along this way. But they've advanced, and what they've learned is already enough so that 2% of the clusters can get 20% of the enrollment. What happens if we can make that 40 clusters instead of 20, or 80 clusters instead of 20, or 200 clusters, which after all is only 20% of our clusters? Then, even if we learn nothing else, but we can just replicate what they already know, we'll double and triple the number of enrollments we already have in a given year. And when we learn to do better, and that is the effective nature of this process, that what it's about is not some recipe, some instant solution, some remedy, take a Ruhi book and then entry by troops occurs. It doesn't happen that way. But what is happening is that all over the country in these clusters, Baha'is are learning how to learning how to translate that which hath been written into reality and action. That's the real victory of the 5-year plan, that all over the Baha'i world, Baha'is are learning how to take in a conscious way what Baha'u'llah said, what the guidance of the House of Justice is, and how to put it in reality, and how to make it work, and how to overcome your fear, and how to organize a devotional meeting that somebody might actually want to come to, instead of just another meeting that we have to drag the Baha'is to. And as we learn that, our clusters are changing, and our communities are changing. And the people of the world are eager to embrace it if we can create the right environment and allow them to come. And in this process, you will have mistakes. You will have problems. The Area Teaching Committee will get on the nerves of the LSA, and the LSA will accidentally offend the assistant or the auxiliary board member, and we'll have a devotional meeting and nobody will come. And people will want to become Baha'is, but will forget to ask them if they want to be. This is all natural. The issue is that as one cycle follows the next, some of the mistakes you made the last time, you don't make them this time. Now you work out those problems. Now you resolve the lines of communication between the institutions. Now your study circle becomes a more effective vehicle for embracing more people who want to come and study. So we learn step by step how to improve. And that process, you put that learning process into place in this next year, in the next 5 years, over the next 16 years. And then you will see the American Baha'i community grow. You will see it develop to a level where it can have an increasing impact on the lives of the people around us in our society. And it will make its contribution to the global learning process. You know, much of the heritage of the Baha'i community, much of the destiny that Shoghi Effendi talked about was because the Baha'i community of the United States was there to be on the cutting edge of learning. What is Baha'i administration? What are the bylaws? How should Baha'i elections be run? That was learned by doing, and a lot of mistakes. A nomination process that helped Shoghi Effendi identify the fact that we don't want to do that. So now we don't do it anymore. But this is the process of learning. At the forefront of the African campaign, of the 7-year plans that took the faith to South America and into Europe, that was the learning of the American Baha'i community. If the American Baha'i community is to achieve its destiny, if it's to fulfill what we know has been promised by Shoghi Effendi, by Abdu'l Baha, then we have to excel in this learning process. How can we not? Otherwise, we'll be unprepared to be able to take the guidance that the House of Justice gives in every one of these stages, now all the way to the fringes of the golden age, and do what needs to be done at that particular organic stage and make that guidance work in reality. And then what we learn will be shared with the rest of the world to shape the next plan. Look at some of the issues that the National Assembly just talked about in its most recent annual report. Local assembly development. youth, race unity. The answers to all of these challenges is found in the action of the 5-year plan. The development of the local assembly. How does the local assembly support and nurture and reinforce this process of entry by troops? How does it work with other assemblies and with the Area Growth Committee and with all this individual initiative to make a sustainable, intensive program of growth? How do we get youth to be at the forefront of this process? In the area of race unity, look at the power of this vehicle of multiplying core activity. It's not one devotional meeting for everybody. Often, in some of the communities I live in, oftentimes some of the most receptive populations are diverse populations. You bring them into this one form of devotional meeting where people are sitting quietly, reading a few selections from a book. That's not devotion to them. They don't feel that spirit. So they come into the Baha'i community because they love Baha'u'llah's teachings, but they don't find a place there because the way the meetings are structured is not spirituality, and they drift away. But now, in a multiplication of devotional meetings, it's not just one. We can have one where there's music and song and it goes on for all hours. And we can have one where you sit and read a few selections from a book. And anybody who wants to go to this one can go, and anybody who wants to go to that one can go. So we're multiplying a diversity of efforts for teaching, educating children, devotional meetings, study circles, and that can adapt to different cultures, to different populations, to meet all of their needs, even within the same city, but not all by coming to the same place. There will still be the meetings where we all come together, although we'll find out that when we do, we might not fit in the building anymore. That's what happened in Maroon. Now that there are 1,000 Baha'is, there's no building in the cluster big enough to hold that Baha'i community, which grew up in all of these small gatherings. The same process we'll experience here. But this allows us to really solve the problem of race unity. Now it's not just a matter of parades, walks, flyers, courses where we come together, all of which are good and all of which are essential. But now it's going to somebody's home and talking to them there and really getting to know them and learning from them and talking with them and getting to know their family in this intimate bond of this interconnected activity of community building and training and teaching the faith. And then you start to work out real problems. It's not the meeting we go to where we can be polite for an hour. Now we go home, we live with one another, and the problems come out and we tackle them and we solve them. So this power of learning and all of these different challenges the community are facing come together in the 5-year plan, and we solve them and we grow in our capacity and we prepare ourselves for all of these stages that lie ahead. All of the learning. This plan, it's about entry by troops. The next couple of plans are like that as well. But what happens in the year 2021? Suddenly we're going to have a few clusters where there's 4,000 or 5,000 Baha'is. And it's not just about growth anymore. Now it's social transformation. How do you make these families better? How do you solve people's economics problems? How do they have an impact on how do now what will be in Maroon maybe 5,000 Baha'is have an impact on the lives of the other 30,000 people there? That's what we're going to have to learn. So each stage of the divine plan will take us to the next stage of learning. What is Baha'i education? What is Baha'i economics? What is a Baha'i state? What is a Baha'i commonwealth? We'll have to learn, and this capacity for learning is something that we're developing now. So in closing, I just want to appeal to you. Maybe you've looked at this whole process kind of from a distance. You know, maybe you're even in an A cluster and you've still looked at it as kind of from a distance. Because being caught up in all the elements, maybe it didn't quite make sense. Why can't we have the good old meeting that we used to have? You know, why do we have to do something different now? If you start to see this pattern emerge, that's the answer. Doesn't mean that the things that we were doing before were bad. They were right for the stage that we were in. Now this new stage has new challenges. Every believer needs to find a part in this process. Okay, you don't want to study the Institute courses? You don't have to. A critical mass of the people in the cluster need to, but it doesn't have to be you. But that doesn't mean you can sit on the sideline. Can you participate in the teaching campaign? Can you invite your own neighbors and contacts? If not, maybe the Institute course would help after all. But if you can do it, do it. Now, collectively with all the other Baha'is in your cluster, to help it advance gradually to establish this intensive program of growth. Every cluster in the United States, all 1,000, should vibrate with this process, even if you're not yet ready to establish an intensive program of growth. No Baha'i should feel that there's not a part for them to play, because you can be this tree. You can put out these branches. You can move people along this path and start to grow that network and raise up others who in turn can raise up others. And then the process will grow and sweep across the country and sweep across the world. And it's my particular hope that here, kind of my Baha'i birthplace, I hope that we'll hear news of this process accelerating in this area. Thank you very much, friends.
Now, Mr. Lampel has consented to take some questions, so all of you who have questions may ask them now, please.
The question was, what comes next after an A cluster? If you recall from the 9 January 2001 message of the Universal House of Justice that launched the 5-year plan, they talked about the idea of an intensive program of growth. That was really the point. But they said don't rush into it, that there are certain kinds of prerequisites. So this idea of clusters advancing D, C, B, A, and so on, was a way of diagnosing where is our cluster, what kind of capacities do we have, what needs do we have, so that we could get to the point where we could launch an intensive program of growth. So in a certain sense, an A cluster, as I said before when I visited, it's like the starting line of the race, it's not the finish line. So just to get to A is the beginning of the process. Now we learn how to have an intensive program of growth, and then it's step by step. Again, it's not that once you have an A cluster, now you're looking for 500 new Baha'is. No, you learn incrementally. If you had 1 new Baha'i last year, then maybe this year you can learn how to get 3. You see, we can imagine if we had 1, how to get 2. Do twice what we did last year, and then we'll have 2. Or maybe if we did so much work, we couldn't do twice as much, but do some of those things better, and then that'll lead to 2. So the learning, whether maybe we don't have anybody who wants to become a Baha'i in our community, but then we learn how to reach out and bring more people in. So every stage of the process, the training, the translating training into practical action, inviting people to come, learning how to teach more effectively. All of those are stages of learning. So in a sense, it's an infinite process then. Even in these clusters where now they have more than 1,000 people a year become Baha'is, they have to build their communities. They have to learn about social and economic development and so on. So it's just a matter of the path continuing. But in most of the places of the world, and I think you're going to see this carry forward into the next plan, what we did in this plan was learn to see in a few places this pattern. What we're going to have to do in the next plan is have this pattern, first of all, grow in those clusters, but then also spread to many, many more. If in this plan we maybe get 150 or so, we need 1,000 in the next plan. So this process of learning will be something that's with you for 1,000 years. So enough to keep all of us busy. This is a very good question. It's about what is being learned about the role of the local spiritual assembly in interacting with other institutions and supporting the intensive programs of growth. I think that at this point, I'm looking for you to give me the answer, honestly. Because what happens is, up to a point, what the World Center is saying is what we know and what we've seen in some places. Then the question becomes, all right, what does that look like? Now, a few things are known. One thing is, at least the local assembly should not obstruct the process. At a minimum, don't be a naysayer. So that's a beginning. local assemblies have a powerful influence on the Friends. If the local assembly is somehow disconcerted about the process, if they think there's a problem, the Friends, that's instantly communicated to the Friends. And so then they freeze. They're in doubt. They're not clear. So even if all the problems are not worked out, if the local assembly takes a proactive turn that, okay, we don't understand this, we see some problems, but we're for it. It's part of the plan. We're going to learn together. We're going to support the cluster in this process. That in itself has a profound effect. The second step is support. In other words, figure out how do we encourage at least the individuals to get involved, to participate in the Institute process, to be engaged in their own activities. We encourage them, we love them. We try to increase the number of our community members who are involved in the process. Maybe in many communities, the assembly members themselves are stepping forward and getting involved, leading by example in the process. That's another way. Both of these things I've said so far, though, are not about the collective, the institutional function of the assembly itself. The last part I think that we're learning is that local assemblies can take a piece of this cluster plan. In other words, should be something that's not much of a surprise. The World Center has the global plan. The National Assembly makes its plan for the country. It doesn't go off and make a separate plan. Its plan is a piece of the international plan. When the regional councils formulate the regional plan, it's not something other than the national plan. It's a piece of this national plan. And so the same way, when there's a cluster plan, the local assembly can look and say, well, what piece of this plan can we take part in? If the idea is to raise up 50 teaching teams, can we mobilize 5 of those teams in our community? If it's to find a receptive population, maybe we can go to the reflection meeting or approach the area growth committee and say, we have a receptive population over here on our college campus. So the assembly can see its role as a piece of this larger cluster process and be an active agent. Now, I think there's a lot more to learn from that. I think already some of the members of the National Assembly were sharing with me before some of the things that they're learning about this. So I think what we'll see is, since the Teaching Center talked in November about what was already apparent in a few of these clusters about the intensive program of growth, that threw open the door for learning about how assemblies are involved. 1 year later, 6 months from now, we'll have some lessons drawn from that. And some of those lessons might find their way into the next 5-year plan as being guidance that we can't give until we actually see it work. You see, if you ask the House of Justice, how's that supposed to work? It can't really tell you. It can tell you, just like at the beginning of the plan, it talked about an intensive program of growth, but it didn't describe what we were able to describe after the 4th year of the plan. The Baha'is learned what that was like. In Maroon and Baku and a few other clusters, they started the pattern and it was successful. So it became the pattern you could share with other places. I think what the American Baha'i community and what some of the other communities in the world are learning about the active involvement of assemblies in that process will write the next few paragraphs of the next plan when it comes to informing assemblies worldwide what they should be doing. The question was about how does the concept of pioneering, leaving your community, fit into this process of the plan. And I think that this is something that's been an aspect of all the plans and will continue, I think, into the foreseeable future. And obviously, Baha'u'llah, Abdu'l-Baha talked about the concept of arising, leaving your country, going to another place to pioneer. The American Baha'i community has long carried a substantial portion of these international pioneering goals. It does in this plan. There's an urgent need for pioneers. But where will those pioneers go? To other clusters in other parts of the world to do the same process. Some things about it will be different. Instead of going to the D cluster, maybe you'll pioneer to the A cluster, because the cutting edge of learning is an intensive program of growth. If you go, the pioneers should prepare themselves to be this tutor, to be this agent, to be this one who's knowledgeable through their own experience and their own training. to go participate in the same process in a different setting wherever they go? Well, I think 5 billion people have that, and 1 billion people don't. You have to find the 1 billion that don't. I mean, honestly speaking, if people are in a comfort zone, maybe you can open their heart, but maybe you can't. So again, we should look for the ones who are receptive to this process, and to whatever degree they are receptive. In other words, they might not want to become a Baha'i, but maybe they're moved by the Baha'i prayer and would like to come to a devotional meeting. That's good enough. In other words, create this environment, create a welcoming environment where people can feel the spirit of the faith. Look at those World Congress tapes. If you participated in the World Congress, think about how you felt there. Go back in your community and try and create that kind of feeling for people, and that will open their hearts. But the experience worldwide, even in Western Europe, is that there are people out there. We carried in our minds the fact that maybe they weren't. And a lot of the people maybe we ran into weren't. But there are also a lot out there who are. We have to find them. It might not be the people we immediately think. But more often than not, I'll tell you, what the Baha'is are finding in London and other places, it was not that the people weren't really receptive. It's that we thought they were, and we didn't make an effort to go get them. We thought they were, so we didn't offer to say that prayer. We didn't invite them to come to our study circle because we figured they weren't really interested. And when people finally made the effort, they found some of them were. And the ones that weren't were still their friends, as I read from that quote. So we need to look for the ones who are, and we need to create the kind of environment that will begin to touch their hearts. One is about the reaction to One Common Faith. At this point, I haven't really seen any kind of systematic response. There have been individual letters and comments of appreciation and things like that. But I don't know, generally I haven't seen anything. Now it could very well be there, but I haven't been on the job very long, so I haven't read all the reports. But I think we'll understand that better as time goes by. The other is news from the World Center. I think that gradually, obviously, the thing on the minds of everyone, really in every country of the world, is this last phrase in the last paragraph, or near the end of the Rizvan message, where the House of Justice appeals to the Baha'is in every part of the world to seize this process of learning and advance it in the few remaining months of the plan. I think that's what's really coming from the World Center. All over the world, people are doing this, and the news is flooding in. And it's wonderful news, really. From the vantage point of the World Center, there's no doubt that this process is transforming the world. Thank you again, friends. I just want to, of course, add what I should have probably said at the beginning, which is all of these comments are obviously just the impressions of an individual. They're my own, not speaking on behalf of the House of Justice. But it's been a pleasure to be with you and to talk with you all tonight. Thank you.